I had not wanted the midwinter right this year. I had not wanted it the year before, or the year before that. But I was Alpha King of Dravenmore Hold, and the midwinter right was older than my bloodline. Older than the stone walls my grandfather's grandfather had raised above the Ashfeld lowlands. And so the hall was lit with 100 oil lamps, and my council was seated at the long table to my left, and 300 wolves of my pack filled the benches from threshold to hearth, and I sat on the throne at the top of the dais and watched the door. 11 years. 11 years I had sat on that throne and watched the candidates my council brought before me, the daughters of allied packs, the high-born she-wolves of the Central Territories, the carefully dressed women who arrived with letters of recommendation and scent-marked credentials as if a faded bond could be arranged like a trade agreement. I had looked at every one of them. My wolf had looked, too. We had felt nothing. Not absence exactly, more like looking at a landscape through glass, clear, undeniable, and entirely unconnected to anything inside us. I had told my council this, year after year, and year after year they had nodded and gone away and returned with another file, another candidate, another letter. Elder Vorlin, who had served my father and now served me, and who I suspected had served my grandfather in some previous life purely out of spite, had called me into the council chamber 3 weeks before the rite. "My king," he said, with the particular tone that meant he believed he was being patient, "the pack requires a Luna. The bloodline requires an heir. 11 years is." "A fact," I said. "I am aware of it. We have identified a candidate from the Grayville line, a she-wolf of considerable." "No." He paused. He had the kind of face built for pausing, deep-set eyes under heavy brows, the look of a man perpetually deciding whether to be wounded or outraged. "My king, if you would simply—" "If I simply what, Vorlin? Chose a woman my wolf does not recognize. Swore a bond I do not feel. Built a lie at the center of this pack and called it a foundation." I looked at him steadily. "I will not do it. The right is in 3 weeks. If the bond comes, it comes. If it does not, then it does not, and we hold the right and we eat our venison and we go back to governing the territory, and you stop bringing me candidates as if I were a horse at auction." Vorlin's mouth pressed thin. Behind him, the other council members exchanged glances I was not meant to see and chose not to acknowledge. I rose, and the meeting was over. I should have known better than to think it was over. I heard it from my head of household, Marin, 8 days before the rite. She came to me in the evening with the particular expression she wore when she had information she was uncertain I wanted. "The council has arranged entertainment," she said. I looked up from the dispatch I was reading. Entertainment. A performer from the Ashfeld lowlands. She set a folded letter on my desk. A rhythm keeper's daughter, wolfless, no pack affiliation, no rank. She paused with the precision of someone who knows that precision is its own message. They've billed her as a novelty, something for the pack to enjoy before the formal portion of the evening. I read the letter. It was from Vorlin's office, brief and bright with the cheerful bureaucratic language he used when he was doing something he knew I'd find objectionable. A traveling performer. A colorful cultural tradition of the lowland border settlements. An opportunity for the pack to experience something outside its usual sphere. I set it down. "They've arranged this," I said carefully, "to embarrass her." Marin said nothing, which was how she confirmed things she didn't want to be recorded as having said. I understood it immediately. The council's logic was not complex. If they could not persuade me to take a Luna through reason, perhaps they could do it through contrast. Bring in a wolfless, rankless girl from the border flats, someone wholly out of place in a great hold. Let the pack have their laugh. Let me see what the alternative to a proper highborn she-wolf looked like. And then perhaps I would be more amenable to Elder Vorlin's very reasonable suggestions regarding the Grayville line. It was petty. It was small. It was exactly the kind of move that reminded me why I spent so much of my time governing alone. Cancel it, I said. My king, Marin hesitated. If you cancel it now, the girl has already left the lowlands. She's been traveling for 5 days. She would arrive to find the engagement withdrawn in winter with no place to stay and no way to recoup the journey. I was quiet for a moment. Fine, I said, she performs. She's paid well above whatever the council offered, and she's housed in the East Wing guest quarters, not the servants' hall, and no one in my pack laughs at her. I picked up the dispatch again. Make that clear. Yes, my king. She left. I stared at the words on the page without reading them, and I thought, 11 years of this. 11 years of a council that cannot accept that a bond is not a committee decision. 11 years of watching my wolf sit in the back of my chest like a stone and wait for something I had nearly stopped believing would come. I was 43 years old. I was not a man who indulged in despair. But that night, alone in my study with the fire going low, I allowed myself to think that perhaps the bond simply hadn't come for me. Perhaps some alphas waited and waited and the recognition never arrived. The mate simply didn't exist, or existed somewhere the thread couldn't reach. Perhaps this was what my life was: the throne, the territory, the council's games, and an empty half of a bond no one would ever fill. I set the dispatch aside. I went to bed. I slept badly, which was not unusual. 8 days later, Lyrian of the Ashfeld lowlands arrived at the gates of Dravenmore Hold. I did not see her arrive. I heard the gates from my study window, the winter creak of the iron hinges, the muffled report of the gatekeeper's voice, and I did not look up from the boundary survey I was annotating. I was Alpha King. I did not stand at windows to watch entertainers arrive. What I knew, Marin's report. A young woman, traveling alone, arrived with a leather instrument case and a single pack, wearing a traveling cloak the color of undyed wool and boots that had seen genuine use. She had been polite to the gatekeepers. She had thanked the stable hand who took her horse. She had asked, with apparent genuine curiosity, about the age of the eastern wall. She looked at the hold the way visitors usually look at the lowlands, Marin reported, as if she was trying to understand it rather than impress it. She's been told what she's here for, I asked. She's been told she's performing at the midwinter rite. The council's letter described it as an honor. I was quiet, and the truth. She doesn't know. Marin folded her hands. She believes she was sought out for her skill. The ugliness of it settled in my chest like cold water. She didn't know. She had traveled 5 days in winter across the Ashfeld flats believing she'd been invited for her gift, and the council had arranged it as a joke, and she had no idea. She has dinner this evening in the East Wing, I said. Send my compliments, and tell her. I stopped. Tell her nothing that isn't true, just make certain she has everything she needs and is treated as a guest. I went back to the survey. I did not think about her again until the night of the rite. Or I told myself I didn't. In truth, I found myself once, standing at the north corridor window where it overlooked the east courtyard, not quite watching a woman in an undyed cloak cross the snow toward the stables in the early morning. She moved carefully in the snow, not cautiously, but precisely, the way a person moves who is accustomed to navigating terrain they haven't memorized yet. She carried nothing in her hands. She stopped once and looked up at the hold's eastern tower, and even from that distance I could see her expression was thoughtful rather than awed. She went into the stable. She was in there for a long time. When she came out, she was holding a small wolf pup, one of the litter that the stable she-wolf had dropped 2 weeks ago, too small and too cold, that we'd been trying to keep alive with warm cloths and careful feeding. The pup was pressed against the woman's throat, both of her hands cupped around it, her head bent down. She stood in the courtyard in the snow for a full minute like that, perfectly still, the pup against her pulse. Then she went back inside. I turned away from the window and did not return to it. The night of the rite arrived the way winter nights arrive in Dravenmore. Abruptly, The dark falling like a curtain dropped at the end of the afternoon, the temperature dropping with it, the hold coming alive with lamp glow, and the noise of 300 wolves finding their places in the great hall. I dressed in my formal regalia, the dark fur cloak, the engraved pauldrons, the crown I disliked wearing and wore anyway because the rite required it, and I descended to the hall. The hall was as I had known it all my life. The great vaulted ceiling, the long tables, the dais at the far end where my throne sat elevated above everything, the oil lamps burning in their iron sconces, the smell of venison and wood smoke, and the faintly mineral scent of cold stone that no amount of fire ever fully chased away. My wolves, the Dravenmore pack, 300 of them, my people, my responsibility, filling the benches with the particular organized noise of a community that has done this many times before. My counsel was at the table to my left. Vorlon caught my eye and nodded with the careful neutrality of a man who has done something he expects to be criticized for and has prepared his defense. I looked at him for one long moment and said nothing, which I knew he found more unsettling than a reprimand. I took the throne. The rite's formal portions came first, the seasonal acknowledgments, the territory reports, the pack business that had accumulated through the autumn and was being formally resolved before the winter's close. I moved through it efficiently. The hall listened. I was a competent king, if not always a warm one, and my pack trusted my governance even when they were uncertain about my silences. Then Vorlon rose and said, with a smoothness I recognized as rehearsed, "My king, before the evening concludes, the council has arranged a small entertainment. A performer from the Ashfeld lowlands, come to share the cultural traditions of the border settlements with Dravenmore Hold." The laughter was not immediate. It came as a murmur first, not cruel exactly, but the particular murmur of a crowd that has been primed to find something amusing and is looking for its cue. I knew the sound of an audience prepared for a joke. I had heard it in the voices of the council members who thought I was too far from the door to hear them speak. I said nothing. I sat very still on the throne and I watched the hall doors. They opened and Lyrian walked in. She was not what I had expected. I don't know precisely what I had expected. Someone flustered, perhaps, or performing a confidence she didn't feel, aware on some level that the room was not entirely friendly. What I saw instead was a woman who walked into 300 wolves and a lit great hall the way she'd walked across the courtyard in the snow. Carefully, precisely, with her attention on understanding the space rather than performing ease within it. She was slight. Her dress was plain, a deep blue-gray, modest and well-made but clearly not a court dress, something she'd brought from home. Her hair was dark and pinned back simply. She carried her leather instrument case in one hand and had the other free at her side. She was not beautiful in the way the council's preferred candidates were beautiful, not polished, not assembled, not displayed. She was simply present, and the quality of that presence was unusual. She walked to the center of the hall floor and set her case down and straightened, and she looked once around the room. She knew. I saw it the moment it registered. Not in a flinching way, not with visible distress, but the brief, absorbing stillness of a person who has just understood something important and is deciding what to do with that understanding. The murmur in the crowd, the particular quality of Vorlon's smile. The way her introduction had been brief and vaguely jovial, and had not, in fact, said anything specific about what she was supposed to perform. She stood very still for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she opened her case. I had begun to rise from my throne. Not visibly, I had not moved yet, but I had begun to rise from my throne in the way that happens inside a man before the body catches up. The decision made, the action forming, not yet arrived. I was going to stop this. I was going to say something from the dais that would reframe the evening and remove the punchline from the council's joke, and let this woman finish her performance and leave with her dignity intact. But she moved first. She lifted a small drum from the case, a handheld drum, shallow-bodied, the kind the lowland rhythm keepers used, with a frame of dark wood and a head of stretched hide. She held it at her side. She didn't sit, didn't take a position, didn't prepare in any way that announced she was about to perform. She simply stood for a moment with the drum in her hand, and her eyes went to the floor in front of her, and she was still. Then she began. Not with the drum. She began with her breath, a slow, complete exhale, followed by a settling as if she were setting something down inside herself. The murmur in the hall shifted. Not silenced, not yet, but changed, the way sound changes when a room begins, without deciding to pay attention. She struck the drum once. The sound was extraordinary. Not loud, the hall was large and the drum was small, and the sound should have been lost in the space. Instead, it seemed to find the hall's acoustics with a precision that felt designed rather than accidental. A clear, round tone that hit the vaulted ceiling and came back, and the echo was still moving when she struck it a second time, layering, and then she began to move. The murmur died. I have been Alpha of Dravenmore for 11 years, and I inherited a hold whose founding is 700 years old, and I know every tradition, every story, every gesture that belongs to this place. I know the Dravenmore founding cycles the way I know my own heartbeat, not because I studied them formally, but because they are in the walls and the air, and the rhythm of everything the hold has ever done, the invisible grammar of this specific pack in this specific territory. I recognized what she was doing 4 measures in. She was dancing the Dravenmore founding movement. Not approximately, not adjacently. The specific cycle, the weight shift pattern, the arm positions, the particular timing between the drum beats that is not written anywhere because it was never written. It was only ever passed body to body through the rhythm-keeping lines of the Ashfeld lowlands, the communities that had served and supported the northern holds for 3 centuries before the territories were formally divided. The founding movements of the great holds had been kept by the lowland rhythm keepers as a form of living archive, and those rhythm keepers had passed them to their children, and their children had passed them on, and Lyrian's father had apparently passed this one to her. She didn't know she was dancing Dravenmore. That was the thing I understood watching her face. She wasn't performing for us. She was doing the thing her body knew how to do, the thing she'd practiced most, the one her father had taught her most carefully, the one that lived deepest in her muscle memory. She had chosen it, perhaps, because it felt like solid ground in an uncertain room. She was standing on the most familiar thing she had. She didn't know that the most familiar thing she had was this hold's founding heart. The wolves were silent. Not merely quiet, silent in the way that the Dravenmore pack went silent for only a handful of things. For the Alpha's word in battle, for the death of one of their own, for the old pack rights in their original form. The benches were still. 300 wolves sat without moving, their attention oriented toward the center of the hall with a unanimity that was not polite attentiveness, but something older. My wolf stirred. Not the restless, dismissive stir I had felt for 11 years when the council brought me candidates. The movement that was really an absence, the reflex of checking and finding nothing. This was different. This was the way a compass stirs when the north comes into range after a long journey through territories where the needle had been pointing to uncertainty. Not dramatic, utterly certain. She turned and the drum pattern shifted, and the next measure of the founding cycle began. The passage my grandfather had always called the hold's breath, the section that described not the building of the walls but the first wolves claiming the territory, the first pack choosing to stay. I had heard it described in words many times. I had never heard it in movement. I understood why the words had always felt insufficient. The mark on my wrist, the Alpha's mate mark, dormant for 43 years, the mark that had never done more than sit quietly under my skin like a scar that had forgotten its own history, began to warm. I looked down at my wrist. I had been told this happened. Every Alpha is told because it is part of the tradition. The mate mark warms when the bond comes. I had heard it described by my father, by the old masters, by the few alphas in the wider territories who had found their fated mates late in life. They all said the same thing. It doesn't feel like what you imagine. It feels like something you already knew. It felt like something I already knew. The warmth deepened. I kept my hand still on the arm of the throne. I could see it now, the faint luminescence moving through the lines of the mark, the old silver blue that was the Dravenmore bond's color, the color I had seen in the ceremony documents and the historical records, and never once on my own skin. My council, to my left, had not noticed. They were watching the floor, watching Lyrian, wearing the expression of people who had expected laughter and received silence, and were not certain what to do with the silence. She turned again. The founding cycle was moving toward its third movement, the section that described the first alpha's claiming of the territory, the formal binding of the pact to the land, and the drum's rhythm changed, slower and deeper, something that wasn't sound so much as weight. Every wolf in the hall bowed their head. Not staged, not ceremonial. It happened the way breathing happens, because the body does it before the mind decides. 300 Dravenmore wolves bent their heads to the movement of the founding cycle being danced in their great hall, and the only sound was the drum, and the only thing moving was Lyrian. And then the mate mark on my wrist burned. Not painfully, but visibly, the silver-blue light coming through the skin in full, readable at distance, the way a lamp is readable across a room. I heard the first intake of breath from my council. I heard the nearest wolf at the front bench make a sound low in his throat that was not words. I stood. I had been alpha of Dravenmore for 11 years. In that time, I had stood from this throne twice in public. Once when a border pact declared open hostility, and I rose to formally answer the challenge. And once when my head of household's mate died in the winter of the 3rd year, and I stood to honor him personally, because the man had served Dravenmore with his whole life. Those were the only 2 times. I rose now. The drum stopped. Lyrian froze. She had been in the middle of the 3rd movement's final passage, the section that settled the founding, the hold established, the pact complete. She stood on the floor of my hall in her plain blue-gray dress with her drum at her side, and she looked up at me, and for the first time since she'd walked in, I saw something that was not composed control in her face. It was not fear. It was something more honest than fear, the expression of a person who has been braced for something and received something else entirely, and doesn't yet know what to do with that. I came down from the dais. The hall was so quiet I could hear my own footsteps on the stone, the particular sound of the great hall's floor under formal boots, a sound I had heard 10,000 times, never like this. I walked through the benches. My wolves moved without being asked, a slow tide of bodies shifting to open the path from the dais to the center of the floor, not because they were moving aside for their alpha, but because the pack instinct of the Dravenmore wolves, old, bone-deep, 700 years of it, was telling them to witness. I stopped in front of her. She was smaller than she'd seemed across the hall. Up close I could see the careful construction of her composure, not brittleness, but the genuine effort of someone keeping something precise. Her eyes were dark and steady, and she was looking at me the way she'd looked at the eastern tower from the courtyard, trying to understand, not to impress. "You're the Rhythm Keeper's daughter," I said. My voice came out low, not because I was trying to be quiet, because the hall was so silent that my normal register would have rattled the ceiling. She swallowed once. "Yes, my king." "Your father's name?" She blinked, briefly surprised by the question's direction. "Edrin, Edrin of the Ashfeld Cycles." I knew the name. Not personally. The Lowland Rhythm Keepers were not people a Northern Hold Alpha regularly met, but by reputation. Edrin of Ashfeld was one of the last true cycle keepers, a man who had spent his life preserving the founding movements of the Northern Holds in their original form. He had been sought by scholars, occasionally, who wanted to document what he knew. He had always declined, on the grounds that the cycles belonged in the body and not in a book. "How long did he teach you this cycle?" I asked. Something moved in her face. 12 years, she said, since I was old enough to stand. "Did he tell you which hold it belonged to?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, he said I'd know when I arrived at the right place." A pause barely perceptible. "He also said I'd probably arrive at the wrong time, and that was part of it." My wolf, which had been oriented toward her with the absolute, undistracted attention of a compass finding north, made a sound in the back of my chest that I had never heard from it before. Not a growl, not a howl, nothing aggressive. Something quiet and full, like a room filling with light. I raised my left wrist. The mate mark was visible to everyone in the hall, the silver-blue lines burning clearly through the skin, unmistakable, the bond light of a fated mate at the moment of recognition. I held it out to her without speaking. She looked at it. Her expression did something complicated and quiet that I could not fully read, and then she looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw not the composed woman who had walked into a room full of hostile attention and chosen to stand her ground on the most familiar thing she had. I saw the woman beneath that, the one who had traveled 5 days in winter because she believed she'd been sought out for what she knew. The one who had stood in a courtyard at dawn and held a sick wolf pup against her pulse because she could not. She looked at the mark, she looked at my face. "I didn't know," she said very quietly. Not an apology, a fact offered carefully. "I know you didn't," I said. "Neither did I paused. Your father might have had some idea." Something that was not quite a smile moved across her face. "He does that." I removed my cloak. It was a formal cloak, the Dravenmore winter regalia, dark fur over engraved ceremonial fabric, the kind of garment a hold displays at the midwinter rite to represent the continuity of its lineage. I had worn it at every rite for 11 years. I took it from my shoulders and placed it around hers. The hall did not make a sound. "What is your name?" I asked. This was form. I knew her name, Marin had told me. The council's arrangement had included it, but the question was not about information. It was about her choosing to answer here in front of everyone. I was asking her if she wished to be acknowledged. She understood. I could see that she understood. "Lyrian," she said steadily, "Lyrian of Ashfeld." "Lyrian of Ashfeld," I said, and I turned to face my hall. 300 wolves. My counsel at the table to the left, Vorlin's face gone carefully blank in the way that people's faces go blank when they are recalibrating quickly. The benches of my pack, every wolf oriented toward the center of the floor, where a wolfless girl from the border flats stood in the Alpha King's cloak, with the founding cycle's final note still hanging in the air above them. "The mate mark has recognized her," I said. I kept my voice measured and clear, the Alpha's voice in formal address, not raised, not needing to be. "The founding cycle has responded to her. What my council brought here tonight as entertainment is my fated mate, and the pack's recognition is not a surprise to me, because I have watched this pack know things before I did for 11 years, and they have always been right." The silence stretched for one long beat. Then the wolves of Dravenmore bowed. Not all at once. It moved through the benches from the front, like a wave moving through still water, each wolf bending their head as it reached them, until the entire hall was bowed except for my council, who were standing in varying degrees of arrested motion, and Lyrian, who was standing very still beside me with her eyes slightly wide. I looked at Vorlin. He was a careful man. He had been a council elder for 30 years. He understood power and its movements better than most. He looked at my face, and at the mark on my wrist, and at the cloak on Lyrian's shoulders, and at 300 bowed wolves, and he made the calculation that a man of his experience makes when the landscape has changed entirely. He bowed. The others followed. I had arranged a private room for the formal exchange before Marin had finished her first sentence on the subject. She had come to find me while the hall was still in the slow process of rising and reorganizing itself. The particular noise of a large gathering that has just witnessed something significant and is working through the aftermath. And I had already sent for tea and told the night steward to prepare the small council chamber off the north corridor. Lyrian sat across from me at the small table. She had not removed my cloak. She had a cup of tea between her hands, and she was doing the thing I had already come to recognize as characteristic of her, making sense of a situation by being quiet and attending to it before she spoke. I waited. She said eventually, "The council arranged this." "Yes." "To embarrass someone." "You specifically," I said, "though I think the broader aim was to embarrass me, and you were the mechanism." She considered this. "That's a very elaborate plan for very little return." "My counsel is patient. They've been trying to persuade me to take a Luna for 11 years. This was a new approach." She looked at me steadily. "Did you know what they'd done?" "I knew they'd brought you here under false pretenses. I didn't cancel the engagement because you'd already traveled 5 days, and I didn't want you to arrive to a withdrawn invitation in winter." I paused. "I was going to intervene from the dais. You moved before I did." She was quiet for a moment. "What were you going to say?" Something gracious enough to reframe it without directly humiliating my counsel in public. I hadn't worked out the exact wording. "That's a delicate line." "Governing usually is." She looked at her tea. The lamp in the room was warm, the light steady, and in it I could see what the hall's distance hadn't shown me. She was tired. Not the bone weariness of distress, the solid tiredness of someone who had traveled far and held themselves carefully in a difficult situation and was now in a smaller room with fewer people, allowing the edges of that to show. It suited her. It made her more present, not less. "I don't know much about fated bonds," she said. "The lowland settlements, we don't have pacts, we don't have alphas. The rhythm keepers are the closest thing we have to a formal tradition, and that tradition is mostly about preservation." She looked up. "My father used to say that the cycles carry what the people who made them were feeling when they made them. That's why they have to be taught body to body. You can't get it from a description. You have to feel it moving." "He's right," I said. The founding cycle of Dravenmore was composed in the first winter this hold was inhabited. The pack that built this place had just survived a significant loss, a border conflict that had cost them a third of their number. The cycle is about surviving and choosing to stay, about finding that the territory is worth remaining in, even after what it cost. She was looking at me with the attention she gave to things that mattered. "Your father taught you this one above the others," I said. "It wasn't a question." "He taught me all of them," she said. "But this one, yes. He said it was the most complete, that whatever it was looking for, it had the most to offer when it found it." She paused. I thought he was being sentimental. "He's often sentimental about the cycles." He was right about that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does the mark mean, formally? I know what fated bonds are in general terms, but—" "It means the bond has recognized you as my fated mate," I said. "The mark itself is a physical record of the recognition. When you pressed your palm to it in the hall," I paused. She had, after the bowing was done and the hall had begun its slow return to movement, pressed her palm briefly to the back of my wrist. I had not asked her to. She had done it as if it were a natural extension of what had already been acknowledged. The mirror mark had traced itself across her own wrist in the same moment, the same silver blue, unmistakable. The mirror mark appearing on your wrist means the bond has been accepted. Not formalized, there are formal ceremonies for that if you choose them, but recognized by both. She looked at her wrist. The mirror mark was faint now, the way it went between the closer moments, but it was there, a tracing of silver blue under the skin. "If you choose them," she repeated. "Yes," I said. "The bond is destined. What you do with it isn't. I won't—" I stopped. I had been about to say something and I wanted to say it correctly. I won't ask you to make decisions tonight that don't need to be made tonight. You've traveled 5 days and been brought here under false pretenses and stood in a great hall full of people who weren't sure whether to laugh at you, and then this. You're allowed to have time. She looked at me for a long moment. The lamp was warm between us. Outside the narrow window, Dravenmore's winter pressed quiet against the glass. The pup, she said, the one in the stable. I hadn't expected the direction. What about it? Is it still alive? As of yesterday, it's been tenuous. She nodded slowly. I spent 2 hours with it this morning. I don't know if that's, she paused. I've always been able to calm sick animals. My father said that was the rhythm keeper's gift expressing itself sideways because I didn't have the drum technique fully formed yet when I was small. The animals responded to it before I did. She looked at her hands around the cup. I couldn't tell if it made any difference. I hope it did. I'll ask Marin in the morning, I said. All right. She looked at me again, that same steady, assessing attention. What do I call you, outside of my king? Kalen, I said. She nodded. Lyrian, she said, as if we were starting over, which I suppose we were. I know, I said. I was listening when you told me. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, not quite not. You were listening before that, I think. Yes, I said. I was listening before that. The formal ceremonies of the Dravenmore bond took place 12 days later, in the same great hall, before the same 300 wolves, with a great deal more preparation, and rather more ceremony than the midwinter rite had expected to involve. Lyrian had stayed. She had not stayed because I asked her to. I had made clear, over the first 3 days, that she could leave at any point and that I would arrange safe passage and make certain her journey was comfortable, and that the bond's recognition would wait for whatever time she needed. She had listened to all of this with the careful, attending patience that was, I was beginning to understand, simply how she received information she considered important. On the 4th morning she had said, I'd like to stay. All right, I said. I want to see the rest of the hold properly, she said, not as entertainment, as someone who is trying to understand it. That's allowed. And I want to learn more about the bond, how it works, what it means in practice, what the formal options are. She paused. I want to make a decision I understand. That's also allowed, I said, encouraged actually. She had spent the next 8 days moving through Dravenmore the way she'd moved through that first courtyard and that first hall, with attention rather than performance. She spoke with Marin, who gave her the hold's practical history. She spoke with the pack's elder healer, who had worked with lowland rhythm keepers before, and who told me afterward that the girl had a healer's instinct and should have been formally trained. The wolf pup in the stable had recovered fully, which the stable master attributed variously to the warmer winter weather and to the extra feeding rotation, and to, apparently, the young woman who had sat with it for 2 hours in the snow, and which I suspected was most accurately attributed to the last one. She spoke once with Elder Vorlin. I don't know everything that was said. I know the shape of it. She had asked for the meeting herself. She had gone in alone. She had been in there for an hour. Vorlin had come out looking like a man who had expected to explain himself and had instead been asked to understand something, and had found the experience unsettling and valuable in equal measure. He had said to me afterward, she asked me whether I genuinely believed I was acting in the hold's interest. He paused. I told her yes. She told me she believed me. Then she explained why that made it worse. Another pause. She is not what I expected, my king. No, I said, she isn't. On the 12th day, she came to find me in my study. I've made my decision, she said. I set down what I was working on. I waited. I want the formal ceremony, she said. Not because it's required, because it's the honest thing to do. She settled into the chair across from my desk. She had started doing that, settling into the chairs in my study with the ease of someone who had decided a space was trustworthy, and I had started finding it the most comfortable part of my days. The bond recognized me in front of everyone. I want my choice to be witnessed the same way. All right, I said. And I want my father here, she said, if that can be arranged. It can be arranged, I said. I'll send riders tomorrow. She nodded. Then she looked at me with that particular directness. You're not going to tell me what to do with my life after this, are you? After the ceremony? No, I said. Or where to be or how to. Lyrian, she stopped. I have been Alpha of Dravenmore for 11 years, and in that time I have learned that the things that work best in this hold are the things that are allowed to be what they actually are, rather than what someone decided they should be. I looked at her steadily. You are a Rhythm Keeper's daughter from the Ashfeld Flats, and you carry 700 years of this hold's founding heart in your body, and you have a healer's instinct that the Elder Healer wants to formally discuss with you, and you convinced Elder Vorlin, who has never in 11 years conceded a point without a significant argument, to examine his own assumptions in under an hour. I paused. I'm not going to tell you what to do with any of that. I would like to watch what you decide if you'll let me. She was quiet for a moment. The study's fire was going steadily, the warmth of it against the winter outside. That was more words than you've said to me at once, she said. I had things to say. She looked at me, and this time the thing in her face that wasn't quite a smile was rather closer to one. All right, she said. Send the riders. Edrin of Ashfeld arrived 5 days later, which meant the riders had found him remarkably quickly, which meant he had been somewhere nearby, which meant he had known. He was a tall man, lean with traveling and age, with his daughter's dark eyes and her manner of attending to things carefully. He walked into the great hall for the formal ceremony carrying nothing, as the lowland Rhythm Keepers attended formal occasions with nothing but themselves, and he went to stand beside his daughter in the front of the gathered pack, and he looked at me across the space between us. She's the best one, he said by way of greeting. I know, I said. The cycle she danced is the most complete one. I kept it back from the others on purpose, told her she'd know when she got to the right place. He looked around the great hall with the satisfied expression of a man who has been waiting for something to resolve for a very long time. I hoped it'd be Dravenmore. The signature was always in the north. Lyrian beside him said quietly, You knew. I had a strong feeling, he said, which is the Rhythm Keeper's way of saying I knew. She pressed her hand briefly against her forehead, in the way of a person who is both genuinely exasperated and genuinely fond. Then she straightened, and she looked at me, and she was completely present the way she had been in the hall on the night of the rite, no performance, no brace, only attention. The ceremony was held in the great hall before the full Dravenmore pack. It was not a long ceremony. The bond had already done its work. The formal portion was the acknowledgement and the witnesses. I said what the ceremony required. Lyrian said what she had prepared, which was not the ceremonial form but her own words, spoken with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about what they want to be accurate. That she had come here without knowing what she was, that the hold had known before she did, and that she had decided to stay because she had looked at Dravenmore for 12 days and found it worth remaining in, even with what it cost. I understood why she had put it that way. The founding cycle she had danced on that first night said the same thing in movement. The territory is worth remaining in, even after what it cost. I pressed my wrist to hers. The marks aligned, the original and the mirror, and the silver-blue light moved between them like a circuit completing, visible in the lamp glow of the hall, witnessed by every wolf of Dravenmore, witnessed by Edrin of Ashfeld, who watched his daughter with the expression of a man whose long work has found its right resting place. Lyrian looked up at me when it was done. That's it, she said quietly. That's it, I said. The rest is just living. All right, she said, I can do that. The council did not hold another formal session about the Luna for the rest of that winter, or the spring, or any season after that. Vorlin had apparently done something I had not expected. He had learned something. He had watched a wolfless girl from the border flats stand her ground in the midwinter hall, and then sit across from him and ask him to examine his own intentions, and then witness the Alpha King's mate mark burn to life in front of 300 wolves, and he had arrived at a conclusion about the limits of council planning that I suspected would have taken him another decade to reach under any other circumstances. He told me in the spring, I owe her an apology. She told me she doesn't require one, I said. I know, she told me the same. He was quiet for a moment. That's what makes me feel I owe her one. Lyrian was in the great hall by then 3 mornings a week, working with the elder healer on the question of the Rhythm Keeper's techniques and their relationship to pack healing traditions. She was in the stable on Saturdays with the pup, which had grown strong and ridiculous, and had developed the habit of following her to the doorway of whatever room she was in and waiting. She had sent word to her father about 2 other cycles she thought Dravenmore's records should have, and Edrin had written back with 6, and a suggestion that she consider whether the hold might want a formal cycle archive. She had brought the suggestion to me, and I had said yes before she finished the sentence. I had also, on a Tuesday morning in late spring, found her in the north corridor looking at the eastern tower in the way she'd looked at it from the courtyard on her first morning, thoughtfully, as if she was still making sense of it. The same spot, I said. She turned. You saw me that morning. From the window above the courtyard, I said. Yes. I wondered if anyone was watching. She looked back at the tower. I was trying to figure out why the hold felt familiar. I grew up with the founding cycle, but I'd never been north before. The familiarity didn't make sense. Did you figure it out? Eventually, she looked at me. It's the cycle. I know this place the way you know a song before you know its words, through how it moves, not what it says. She paused. My father would call that the deepest kind of knowing. What would you call it? She considered. Home, she said after a moment. I'd call it that. My wolf has not been still since she arrived. I mean this in the precise and literal way. For 11 years, my wolf sat in the back of my chest like a compass in a territory where north doesn't exist, present, correct in its design, pointed at nothing. Since the night of the midwinter rite, it has not sat still for a single hour. It is not restless. It is the opposite of restless. It is oriented continuously and completely in the way that a compass orients when the territory finally matches what it was made for. It knows exactly where she is at every moment. It knows when she laughs at something the stable master says. It knows when she is in a room with the elder healer, and they have hit on something interesting because the quality of her attention changes and my wolf feels it like a shift in light. It knows when she is in the north corridor on Tuesdays looking at things. It knows when she is tired and when she is not, when something has unsettled her, and when she is simply thinking. This is the fated bond. I had been told it was like this. I had found the descriptions inadequate, the way all descriptions are inadequate for things that can only be understood in the body. The council brought her here to be a joke. My wolf had its first full breath in 11 years. I have been alpha of Dravenmore for a long time now, and I have made many decisions about this hold and this territory and these people, and I have gotten some of them wrong and most of them right, and all of them with the best information I had at the time. I am a careful man. I am not, by nature, a man who trusts in things he cannot verify. I trust this. I trust the founding cycle that she carried in her body without knowing what it was. I trust the wolf pup that pressed itself against her pulse on a winter morning and chose to keep living. I trust the 300 wolves of Dravenmore who bowed their heads without being asked to. I trust the mark on my wrist that burned to life after 43 years of waiting and found the correct answer on the first try. I trust her, the woman who walked into a room full of hostile attention and stood on the most familiar thing she had, who pressed her palm to a mark she didn't recognize and then said she'd like to stay and understand it better before she decided, who sat across from Elder Vorlin and asked him to examine his own intentions, and somehow left him grateful rather than defensive, who decided that the formal ceremony was the honest thing to do and asked for her father to be there to witness it. She is not what anyone expected. She is exactly what was needed. I am beginning to understand that those two things are very often the same. Outside the window, Dravenmoor's summer is coming in slowly, the way it always does in the north, not arriving so much as accumulating, day by day, warmth added in increments until one morning you realize the ground has softened, and the light stays longer, and the old stone walls have released the cold they spent all winter storing. My wolf is awake. My wolf knows where she is. She is in the east courtyard with Edrin, who arrived 3 days ago for his third visit, and who is almost certainly telling her something he already knew before she was born, and is presenting as wisdom he arrived at just now. She is laughing at something he said. My wolf knows this the way it knows everything about her. Completely, continuously, with the absolute orientation of a thing that has found its north after a very long time of looking. The pack that brought her here to be laughed at bows when she walks through the hall. Not because I asked them to, I didn't. Because the Dravenmoor wolves are 700 years old in their instincts, and they know what the founding cycle means, and they knew before I did, the way the pack always knows before I do, and I have stopped being surprised by this and started being grateful for it. I have been alpha of Dravenmoor for 11 years, and before that, I was simply a man who waited for something he had begun to doubt would come. It came in the form of a rhythm keeper's daughter from the Ashfeld Flats, traveling alone, who didn't know what she was carrying. I know now. So does she. So with great and characteristic certainty does the Dravenmoor pack.